Tilea's Troubles, Part 36. A Need for Nightmares. Remas, Spring, 2402. Standing by the window, Father Biagino could already hear the bell ringing faintly in the distance. It was sounding a little earlier than it had the day before. His friend and fellow Viadazan refugee, Father Antonio, who commanded the bell, must be intending to perform a wider circuit through the city streets today, and thus the early start. On each successive occasion, Antonio's procession had grown, as ever greater numbers joined the whipping and wailing, scourging their mortal flesh to purify themselves in Holy Moor's eyes, praying that the same bloody ritual might one day provoke a frenzied urge to fight the foe, no matter how horrifying it was, no matter how monstrous or foul. And the birth of the flagellant cult was almost entirely due to Antonio's incendiary street corner sermons and powerfully ominous prayers. He had stirred Remas from its gentle slumber into a waking nightmare, opening people's eyes to the approaching danger, while the church's highest clergymen, following the arch-lector's dithering lead, seemed forever locked in vacillation, unable to decide exactly what should be done, nor how, when, or where. The way things had been going, it had seemed likely that no Riemann blade would be unsheathed until the undead legions were already scrabbling over the city walls. Biagino could not fault Antonio's ardour, nor deny the need for action. Yet he was not sure that raising another army of apprentices, peasants, and ill-paid mercenaries was the best course. They had done exactly this at Viadaza, and had marched at the head of the ragtag force so created. That army had pushed the enemy back, even brought down the vampire Duke Alessandro. Yet it was still not enough, for while their backs were turned, Viadaza was lost, and the battered remnants of exhausted peasant crusaders could do nothing about it. Death begets death, one old fellow had proclaimed after that battle of Pontramola, as they wandered aimlessly in Viadaza's vicinity, bereft of any hopeful course of action. Biagino had not known exactly what the old fellow meant by this, but nevertheless he suspected it was true. Here, in Remas, Biagino thought, there was a chance to do things differently, better, to gain the backing of church and nobles as well as the common people, and thereby forge a professional army, able to feed itself, march and fight, then march and fight again and again until victory was won. This time they should learn all they could of the enemy, plan and prepare for all possible contingencies, ensure that their lines were secured, the towns and cities adequately garrisoned, the army properly armed. If Father Antonio had his way, however, he would surely once again lead nothing more than a rabble from the city, unprepared, unsupported, and ill-advised. Biagino would rather such men were put to use effectively, doing what they were good at, digging earthwork defences, repairing crumbling walls, driving mules and carts to move supplies. Then the professional soldiers would be properly supported, and better able to concentrate on strategy, tactics, and battle. Dong. The bell's sombre tone was quite contrary to its size and placement. If it were 3 times the size, and housed in a great stone tower rather than suspended from a wooden gibbet, then such a sound might indeed be expected. Biagino wondered whether some enchantment had been put upon it to make it ring with the note of a different bell, from another time and place. That was no doubt the intention, as if it were the bell hanging at the gates of Moor's garden, tolling the receipt of each passing soul. Estimating the bell to be at least 2 streets away, he turned back to the chamber, just as the door opened to admit the man he had been waiting for. Even if Biagino had not been told, he might have guessed the fellow was a fisherman, what with weather-beaten, leathery flesh, clearly advertising years of hard labour in the wind and sun, despite his middle age and a head of hair without a wisp of grey. Carlo was his name, a Viadazan by birth, although now a refugee, like every other living Viadazan. Carlo closed the door, then, by way of greeting, said only, "Father?" Biagino noticed Carlo wore a fighting blade by his side and a pack upon his back, which made him wonder if the man was intending to depart Remus, or perhaps he just wanted to be ready to leave at any instant. When Biagino gestured to the chair, Carlo failed to move. "Please, do sit," Biagino said. "I'm not some great noble-blooded churchman with a multitude of airs and graces. I'm merely another homeless wanderer like yourself." The fisherman seemed barely to register Biagino's words, and instead of taking the seat, walked over to stand behind it, as if standing at a rail in the temple to receive the incumbent's blessing. His eyes were wide and seemed to be focusing on the space between the two of them, rather than on the priest. "Or stand, yes, if you prefer." Hearing a shout from the street, Biagino glanced through the window again. On the street below ran a sleeveless man, bald and with a band of iron fastened about his upper arm. As he pelted down the street, howling, he spun the most vicious iron flail above him, consisting not of one, but 2 barbed weights. Perhaps, thought the priest, he'd shaved his head to avoid a nasty accident, should his hair become entangled. A flagellant. Off to find the bell, no doubt. Hopefully, once he got there, the man would have the sense not to attempt flagellation with his heavy flail, as it was surely much better at killing foes than purging its bearer's sins. When Biagino turned back from the window, for the briefest of moments, Carlo's face appeared to be made of dead flesh, and fearful to behold. Biagino hid any sign of fear, but could not, for a moment, bring himself to speak. It appeared his oniric visions were bent on plaguing his waking hours too. In his dreams, for several nights now, Biagino had found himself back at the bridge of Pontramola, once more with the militia pikemen of Viadaza, his stomach knotted with fear as he witnessed the foe's inexorable advance. Just as in the waking battle, he became fascinated by the motion of their lifeless limbs, the glaring hatred somehow evident in the shadows of their empty eye sockets. They came on steadily, regardless of those that fell among them to bullet and arrow, like waves crashing on despite the rocks, neither slowed nor dismayed. Everything was as he remembered, the way his hand slipped upon the hilt of his sword, the foul stench wafted on the breeze from the massed body of animated cadavers at the centre of the enemy's line. Then, every night, his attention was drawn away from the vampire duke's advancing army, as it dawned on him that he was not where he thought he was, being instead on the southern side of the river, the waters now lying between him and the foe. When had they moved back across the bridge? Why had they changed their plan of battle? Why could he not recall the retreat? Still, he thought, perhaps it's better to be on this side, for then the enemy must ford the river to reach us, being weakened in the attempt. This glimmer of hope, however, died almost instantly, as something else caught the corner of his eye. In that moment, his neck stiffened, and the air suddenly congealed about him to become an invisible force pressing against him. With effort, he forced his head to twist so that he could look at the men by his side. In turn, they looked back at him. Every face sported a fixed, fleshless grin, while their bony hands clutched at splintered and aged pike shafts. Every pair of eyes was sunken within black, bottomless pits, and peered at him as if awaiting his commands. The nearest opened its mouth and shrilled an ear-splitting silence, causing Biagino to stumble, weak-kneed from the ranks, then tumble, face down onto the ground. Then a shadow fell across him, which took away not just the light, but the warmth too. The shadow of something bent, yet strong, its head horned, its hands clawed, wielding a blade almost as big as itself. Finally, just as he expected the huge shadow blade to slash down in a brutal strike, the shadow's other hand reached out, as if to haul him up, and he awoke. Bathed in sweat, shaking and weak of bladder, he scrabbled from his bed, tearing off the sodden blanket as if it were the thing that had wound him into the dream. What could it mean? He knew the dream was surely sent by Moore, for he had become adept at recognizing his God-given premonitions. Yet he could not even say whether it concerned tomorrow, next month, or next year. All he could do, as ever, was suffer the weight until the meaning revealed itself. In the meantime, he had questions to ask the fisherman. "I'm told you've been back to Viadaza. Is this true?" Biagino asked.
"For my sins, father, yes."
"Why would you go there?"
"To get my best boat," said Carlo. "I thought maybe the dead would not think to watch the sea."
"And do they watch the sea?"
Carlo shuddered. "They do."
"Oh," said Biagino. "Well, you are brave. Better than that, you're lucky. I ask you now to be helpful, too. Tell me, what did you see, exactly? When that's done, I shall pray to help you put it from your mind forever."
"Yes, father. I'd like to forget,"
said Carlo. He took air, as if about to jump into the sea, and then spoke.
"I got into the bay after dark. This was not hard for me, as I know it like the back of my hand. Every shoal, every rock, how the currents play in the tides. It was darker than ever before. Not one fire burned in the city, not one window was lit by so much as a single candle. I suppose the undead do not need or want light. But the moons were waxing, which gave me light enough to get my bearings. Dark shadows divided the buildings. Everything was black and grey. I couldn't descry any boats at all, and I thought maybe they'd been hauled further up than usual. So I paddled closer. Dong! The bell's ring grew louder. That's when I spied them, father. I took them to be Lord Adolfo's warehouse guards, brute ogres from the east. And I suppose they were, or they had been before. Now they looked not just mean, but wrong. Their flesh had changed. It was torn, blooded, blue, and pricked with bones. They had skulls dangling all about them, and they stank, not of sweat and dirt like before, but worse even than rotten pork too long at sea. I could smell them, despite being so far away. I knew two of them. I'd seen them many a time, guarding gates or addled with ale in the tippling house by the north gate. Ugly brutes they were, with dead eyes that looked right through you. Now their eyes really did look dead. One of them carried a mast, I think, from which hung a string of bleached bones. Another carried a gravestone, as if it were merely a piece of flotsam. Dong! Rang the bell. It must be entering the street now, thought Biagino. Carlo had not yet seemed to notice. There were half a dozen of them, standing stock still, like statues. Then I spied another, smaller than the rest, its back to me, and I knew the others were ruled by him. He had horns upon his head and shoulders, and he bore a brute's blade, enormous it was, which he hefted as if he were as strong as any of them, and it was no burden to him whatsoever. Biagino's throat tightened, for in his mind's eye he could see that blade's shadow. Even before he turned, continued Carlo, I could tell he knew I was there, and when he did turn, slow and deliberate, like he wanted to rub the fear in deep, his red eyes found me immediately. Dong! In truth, father, I think he's been watching me ever since. What? Said Biagino, his voice faltering. I mean, who was it? It was no man, but it was Lord Adolfo. Twisted most foul, bearing teeth, talons, and horns. Yet still Lord Adolfo. Dong! Biagino could now hear the clattering of the bell cart and the creaking of the wheels, and a familiar voice preaching More's hatred of the walking dead. The light of the flagellant's torches flickered into the room. Glad of the distraction, he turned to the window once more. His heart racing, Biagino watched and spotted Father Antonello, as usual, leading the procession, sword in hand. Behind him came the first of the flagellants, garbed in priestly reds and greys. One had somehow set a burning crown of iron upon his head, and yet still walked beside the others. Surely some sort of clever illusion. Biagino was surprised that Antonello would stoop to using stage trickery. The other flames, borne on torches, were real enough, as was the battered and bruised state of the self-tortured flagellants carrying them. The bell cart was decorated with pages of scripture and an inevitable hourglass. Two robed men struggled with all their might to push it. Dong! Biagino turned back to the room, his heart a little less troubled.
Thank you, Master Carlo. Your report will be passed to those who need to know. You've done good service, and Holy Moor will assuredly reward you. As promised, I will speak of you in my prayers. For now, however, make do with some broth and some ale. You'll find both in the kitchen below. Just tell the servants I sent you. When Carlo had taken his leave, Biagino looked at the mad rabble of flagellants processing along the street in the wake of the bell cart. He did not really see them, however, for his thoughts were elsewhere. Lord Adolfo was indeed now a vampire, just as the Erbemans had claimed. And he still ruled Viadaza. And he had been in Biagino's dreams for some time now.